The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1957. Stan Laurel was sitting in his modest Santa Monica apartment, surrounded by the quiet that had become his closest companion in recent years. Photographs lined the walls. Scripts filled the desk drawers. And somewhere in that stillness, the telephone rang, and the voice on the other end told him that Oliver Hardy was gone. No one who was there that day recorded exactly what Stan did next. Whether he wept, whether he sat in silence, whether he reached for something to hold on to in a room suddenly too large for one person. What we know is this: when the funeral came 6 days later, the chair reserved for Stan Laurel remained empty. And for decades, the world would wonder why. Some called it a betrayal. Others whispered about a falling out, a buried resentment, a friendship that had quietly collapsed before the cameras stopped rolling. Fans who had grown up watching these two men stumble through the world together couldn't understand how one of them could simply not come. But the truth, the real truth, is not a story about absence. It is one of the most quietly devastating acts of love that Hollywood never properly understood. To understand why Stan Laurel wasn't there the day they buried his best friend, you have to understand what they built together. And to understand that, you have to go back to a time before any of it existed. Stan Laurel was born into the smell of grease paint and sawdust. His parents ran a theater in the north of England, and from the time he was old enough to watch from the wings, he understood instinctively that performance was not something you did. It was something you became. He joined Fred Karno's vaudeville troupe as a young man, the same company that launched Charlie Chaplin into the stratosphere. Stan worked as Chaplin's understudy, watching him from the shadows of every stage, studying how a single tilted glance or a half-second pause could turn an ordinary moment into something that made 1,000 people catch their breath simultaneously. It was a masterclass in the architecture of feeling, and Stan absorbed every lesson without anyone knowing he was taking notes. Oliver Hardy came from a different world entirely. Born in Georgia, raised with a natural warmth that never left him, he drifted from singing in local theaters to vaudeville to the chaotic, fast-moving world of silent film. His friends called him Babe, a nickname given by a barber in his childhood that somehow followed him all the way to Hollywood. He was larger than life in every sense, not just physically but in presence, in generosity, in the way he could walk into a room and make it feel inhabited. By the early 1920s, he had appeared in hundreds of films, rarely as the star, always as the man who made everything around him slightly better than it would have been without him. They first shared a screen in 1921 in a small, forgettable silent comedy called The Lucky Dog. Stan played a penniless wanderer. Hardy played the crook who robbed him. They barely exchanged a glance. Neither had any reason to imagine that this unremarkable meeting would become the founding moment of something historic. They were just two men trying to survive Hollywood's earliest, wildest years, collecting paychecks and moving on. It wasn't until 1927, when Hal Roach Studios decided to pair them deliberately, that something happened which neither of them could have engineered or predicted. The chemistry wasn't manufactured. It wasn't the result of a studio calculation or a carefully written pitch. It simply existed, fully formed, immediately undeniable, from the first moment they stood beside each other in frame. Stan's childlike bewilderment against Hardy's magnificent, perpetually wounded dignity. The small man who seemed to exist in a world slightly different from everyone else's, and the large man who believed, against all available evidence, that he was in control of the situation. Together, they created something that wasn't just funny. It was true. Audiences recognized something in that dynamic that went deeper than comedy. They recognized themselves. Over the next 2 decades, they made more than 100 films together. They weren't just performing. They were constructing a language. Stan was the architect. Few people outside the Hal Roach lot understood the degree to which he shaped everything. Rewriting scripts overnight, spending hours in the editing room adjusting timing by fractions of a second, scrapping entire scenes because something in the rhythm felt wrong. He was obsessive in the way that only people who genuinely love something can be obsessive. Comedy, for Stan Laurel, was not entertainment. It was precision. It was care made visible. And Hardy? Hardy trusted him completely. Where Stan carried the work home, Hardy left it at the studio and went to play golf. Where Stan sketched new gags at midnight, Hardy laughed at dinner parties and let tomorrow take care of itself. They were opposites in this too, and perhaps that was the final piece of the chemistry. Stan's relentless anxiety balanced by Hardy's effortless calm, each one providing what the other couldn't find in himself. Their European tours in the 1930s became something close to a royal progress. In Britain especially, audiences didn't merely enjoy them. They adored them with a fervor that bordered on devotion. Thousands lined the streets. Theaters sold out weeks in advance. Two Americans in bowler hats had somehow become folk heroes on another continent. They shared hotel rooms, finished each other's sentences, and developed a private shorthand that only the two of them fully understood. The friendship that was visible on screen was not a performance. It was simply what happened when these two specific people spent 30 years inside each other's orbit. But time does not make exceptions, not even for men who made the world laugh. By the late 1940s, the world that had loved them was quietly, irreversibly changing. The war had altered what audiences wanted from entertainment. Slapstick felt to younger viewers like something their parents enjoyed. Gentle, unhurried, from a softer era. The slow, deliberate rhythm that made Laurel and Hardy timeless to their generation felt old-fashioned to the next one. Stan felt this shift the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not sudden, but unmistakable. Their final film together, Atalke, shot in France in 1951, became one of Hollywood's most painful endings. Both men were visibly unwell. Stan had developed diabetes and heart problems that left him exhausted in ways the camera couldn't entirely hide. Hardy had been battling the consequences of decades of physical strain, and his weight had become a genuine medical concern rather than a comic asset. The production was troubled from the start, logistical chaos, a weak script, language barriers between the French and Italian crews. What emerged on screen was a film in which the laughter, for the first time, felt effortful. Not because the men had lost their talent, but because their bodies were telling them something their hearts refused to accept. When it was over, so was the era. Not with an announcement or a ceremony, but with a quiet mutual understanding that the work they had built their lives around was behind them now. What no one fully saw, what the public could not have known, was what the silence of those years cost Stan Laurel specifically. Because Hardy could retire and find peace on the golf course, and in Lucille's devoted care. But Stan had no equivalent life waiting for him away from the work. Comedy was not what he did. It was the only language in which he fully existed. And without a partner, without an audience, without the specific gravitational pull of Hardy's presence to organize himself around, Stan was left with notebooks full of ideas and no place to put them. In 1954, Hardy suffered a mild heart attack. The warning was impossible to ignore. Under his doctor's instructions, he began a severe diet that resulted in a transformation so extreme that friends and fans barely recognized him. The round, cheerful figure that had symbolized half of the world's favorite comedy team was replaced by something ghostly. A thin, quiet man whose clothes hung loose, and whose face had lost the fullness that audiences had associated with warmth itself. Tabloids speculated about cancer. Some fans wrote letters to magazines asking if he was dying. Hardy never directly addressed the rumors, but those who spent time with him in that period described a man who had grown inward, who understood on some level that the version of himself the public had loved was already gone. Then, in 1956, the stroke came. It was massive. It left Hardy paralyzed and unable to speak. The man whose entire comic identity had been built on expression, the slow burn of his camera glance, the elaborate wounded dignity of his bearing, the precise calibration of a raised eyebrow, was now unable to communicate at all. He was bedridden. Lucille cared for him with extraordinary dedication. And Stan called. He wrote letters. He asked for updates. But Hardy could not answer. Two men who had spent 30 years finishing each other's sentences now sat on opposite sides of a silence that neither of them had chosen. That was their goodbye. Not a conversation. Not a scene. Just letters that arrived and could not be replied to, and a telephone that rang in a house where one man lay still and the other waited, helpless, for news. On August 7, 1957, Oliver Norville Hardy died of cerebral thrombosis. He was 65 years old. The funeral was held at Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. It was a modest ceremony, quiet, dignified, a gathering of family and old colleagues from an industry that moves quickly past its past. Photographers gathered outside. Journalists waited. And every one of them was looking for the same thing: Stan Laurel, standing beside his partner one final time. He never came. The empty chair became a story in itself. Newspapers speculated immediately. A falling out, unresolved bitterness, pride, guilt, the suggestion that their famous friendship had been, in the end, something less than it appeared. Fans who had grown up believing in the inseparable nature of Laurel and Hardy felt a particular kind of confusion. The kind that comes when something you built your sense of the world around turns out to be more complicated than you understood. But here is what those newspapers didn't know. By August 1957, Stan Laurel was a genuinely sick man. The diabetes and heart disease that had been quietly advancing for years had left him physically fragile. His doctor did not merely advise against attending the funeral. He warned Stan directly that the combination of emotional strain and physical exertion could trigger a collapse. The travel alone posed a risk. Standing through a service in the August heat was something his body could not safely do. Stan accepted this. And then he said something that his closest friends would remember for the rest of their lives. He said simply, "Babe would understand." That sentence, for words carrying the entire weight of 30 years. Not an excuse, not a deflection, a statement of absolute faith in the man he had lost, that Hardy, of all people, would know what Stan's absence truly meant. There was something else, too. Something Stan understood about the mechanics of public grief in a way that only someone who had lived inside Hollywood's machinery could understand. He knew that if he appeared at that funeral, frail, visibly broken, the surviving half of the most famous duo in comedy history, every camera in that cemetery would turn toward him. The eulogies would become secondary. The day would stop being about Oliver Hardy and start being about the spectacle of Stan Laurel's grief. And Stan would not allow that. The day belonged to Babe. Every part of it, even the empty chair. He went home instead to the Santa Monica apartment and the quiet and the photographs. And there, in the weeks and months that followed, those closest to him witnessed something that no newspaper reported and no camera captured. Stan kept writing. He had always written sketches, gags, ideas for films that might never get made. But now, in the notebooks that accumulated on his desk in the years after Hardy's death, people who visited him noticed something that stopped them cold. Hardy's name was still there, still written beside his own in scene after scene, as though Stan's hand couldn't quite accept that the other half of the equation was gone. He wasn't writing in grief. He was writing in the only way he knew how, with Babe still in a room, still waiting for the cue, still ready to roll his eyes and puff his chest and look directly into the camera with that magnificent, irreplaceable expression. Stan Laurel never performed again. He turned down every offer without hesitation, without apparent regret. Laurel and Hardy was not an act that could continue with one name. It was a single thing, and that thing was finished. In 1961, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded him an honorary Oscar for his lifetime contribution to film comedy. He didn't attend that ceremony either. He was moved by the recognition, genuinely deeply moved. But the spotlight had lost its meaning without the one person who had always shared it. He died on February 23, 1965, in the same Santa Monica apartment at the age of 74. A heart attack, 8 years after Hardy, long enough to write thousands of pages of comedy that no one would ever perform. Long enough to answer every letter from every fan who had grown up laughing at the two of them together. Long enough to understand, as completely as a person can understand anything, what it means to spend the second half of your life carrying the memory of someone whose absence reshapes every room you enter. The chair at Hardy's funeral was not empty because Stan Laurel had stopped caring. It was empty because he cared so much about protecting Hardy's dignity, about giving the day entirely to the man who deserved it, about honoring a friendship too large and too private for a public ceremony to contain. That staying away was the only gesture equal to the loss. Some people say goodbye by showing up. Stan Laurel said goodbye the only way that made sense to him. He sat down at his desk. He opened a notebook, and he wrote Hardy's name beside his own one more time in a scene that would never be filmed, because the man who would have made it perfect was already gone. If this story stayed with you, share it, because some friendships deserve to be remembered by more than the people who witnessed them.